consent tacitly to just record the session, because after all, it's only me who's saying anything, who's going to be recorded, and then I can share it with those people who are busy doing other things. Okay. So yeah, the first part of what we'll do today, probably about 20 minutes, is actually me doing a bit more talking than I would normally. Okay. So good. Hi, Taryn. Hi, Lily, as well. Other people who are joining us. And I'm going to talk about this question about, is liberalism dead? And I'm going to give you some reasons why we thought that it wasn't, and why it was victorious before 2000, and then what's happened afterwards. And then the last 10 minutes, I suppose, is for you to ask anything you like about the essay question, or anything else we've done about liberalism, or indeed anything else that you want to as well. So we're nearly there. I'll still do another session next week, but that will really be just like a kind of drop-in session if there's something you still need some help with or similar. Okay. People who've just joined us, Thomas was kind enough to ask about this as well. My crown fell out the front, so there'll be just a little bit of whistling, and I've got a big gap there as well, so I'm going to try not to smile too much as well. Okay, good. All right. Any questions before we start? Okay, good. Let's get cracking then. So the reason why we asked this question is because, if I can come on here, is because by the time we get to the end of the 1990s, the 20th century, it looks as though while there had been a Second World War and there would be all sorts of threats to liberal democracy and the system we've got, actually liberalism appears to have won. And the reason why by the end of the 1990s we would say that it's won, that it's the most dominant ideology, that it's and therefore successful because of the way in which it's got a kind of appeal to like a universal appeal to lots of people. That's a kind of like a triumph of ideas, is partly because it's beaten its competitor. And so what I'm going to do here is put down 9 reasons why it had won the argument, and we'll start with these ones. I'll share my notes with you about this afterwards, but maybe for the minute it just makes sense to kind of try and make a note of what I'm talking about as I'm talking about it. As I say, I'll record this, so if I go too fast, you can always go back to this and play it back later. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and when we talk about that, what we mean is actually that led to the destruction of the USSR, Soviet Union, and the Eastern European satellites, which had been based upon the Soviet model as well, and also East Asian and African economies, which had also fallen into the orbit of the Soviet Union, and similar things as well. And so basically what it means is that by the end of the 1990s, liberal free market capitalism and liberal democracies like the ones we understand were the only show in town. Now, they were never really communist. They called themselves communists, but we would describe them as state capitalists because they still had effectively different class stratification. They still had private property. They didn't have any of the things which, communistic societies would have. But what they had was state-planned economies. And what we're saying is that those state-planned economies have failed by the end of the 1980s to meet the needs of their people. And so what we see is, in the 1980s, people in the West getting richer and richer, and people in the East getting poorer and poorer, to the point where people in the East get fed up of it and decide to start taking down their own regimes. And those regimes aren't capable of sustaining themselves. People at the time said about the Berlin Wall and the similar things, they call them velvet revolutions, but they were liberal democratic revolutions. So in that sense, they were kind of partnered with the 18th century and 17th century revolutions, the revolutions against tyranny and in favor of individual freedom. So that looks like a big victory. And it leads on to the even greater extension of free market capitalism. So we get the free market victory as both a cause and effect of the collapse of the Soviet economies. And then this really rapid globalization in which our model, the free market liberal democracy model, becomes the one that's exported to all economies around the world, which had previously had something like a state-planned economy. So where the USSR collapses, it creates a vacuum, and globalization rushes in to fill that vacuum with neoliberalism, with laissez-faire economics, and also with all the things that go with that as well. about mutual trade and reciprocity and frictionless freedom of movement and all those kind of things. And what we also get is a series of multilateral institutions and organizations which promote those and set the rules and the framework for them. So the IMF and the World Bank, they had existed before, but now they become really important in setting the rules for, almost as if they're a kind of supranational state. You know, we've given our tacit consent to be run by these organizations which are beyond nation states, which conduct how the economy is going to, well, how the economy is going to run, but actually how it's going to be left to its own devices. And even if you're a country that wanted to resist that, you know, usually a developing country with a state economy, with a big still public sector or something like that, these institutions find ways of forcing you, usually through debt and denying access to markets, into structural adjustment programs. So they force countries to privatize their own industries and force them to give access to multinational corporations to come and work within their economy. So there's an economic dimension to this as well. Pause for a moment. Okay, good. And as we go through, by the way, I'll keep having an eye on the chat thing. But if you you ask a question and I miss it, then by all means feel free to just unmute your microphone briefly, and then I'll try and answer your question. Okay, so once we've got free market globalization, there are some people who want to argue, and this is particularly true in America. There's an American philosopher stroke economist stroke historian called Francis Fukuyama. He's a Japanese American, and he writes a book called The End of History. And his argument is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, what we've got is only one show in town. Everywhere else, or rather, there is no more competition. There is no more potential for conflict. And so what we're going to have is a future without wars. And then what we're going to seem to have is organizations of several countries, like the EU, where neighbors are able to be so intimately connected with their trade links that now it becomes almost impossible to conceive that they would go to war with each other as they had done in the Second World War, even if they still remain, you know, kind of competitive. And we're going to see the rise of multinational corporations, which come to make a nonsense of having a nation state at all, because they act beyond kind of nation state barriers. And what that's going to do, or what that has done, Francis Fukuyama argues, is create this kind of universal culture, almost like a kind of global village, in which everybody now accepts liberal values about individual freedom and about free movement of peoples and about multiculturalism. And therefore, Fukuyama says that all the conflict has gone out of politics, and that's why it's an end of history. All that we're going to have in future is really benign, good, liberal capitalism in order to make people wealthier and more prosperous and more happier in the future, which seemed like a really nice idea in the 1990s. And I can't see whether you're now frowning at what he would say about that. But yeah, there are lots of people now who say, well, Fukuyama, do you want to go back to what you said and correct yourself? He is actually, but that's another story. This even extends, therefore, to liberalism being a tool which makes other countries better. So once the Soviet Union collapses, then Russia is brought into, it's co-opted into a liberal capitalist economy, and with that, then Russians expect to have the same things, and so they expect to have multi-party elections and freedom of speech of a type. In Russia, they expect to have, you know, a press that isn't necessarily controlled by the state. And in China, even though it's still a one-party state, what we have is Chinese people expecting to be able to express themselves through their own forms of social media, through art and culture, and to have access to be able to travel, you know, broadly around the world. And then through that, they're going to absorb other people's values and culture as well. So there's an idea that what liberalism has done is not only won and beaten the Soviet Union, but is now capable of liberalizing everywhere else. And that's, as far as fans of liberalism are concerned, a good thing. All these things are a result of, this is our fifth thing, all these things have come about as a result of the economic, and I guess what we'd say is neoliberal free market thing. But what's really interesting, and I think this is kind of a bit of a clincher for the argument about why people thought liberalism had won, is that actually, whilst the right has won the argument about, the right wing has won the argument about economics, the left gets to keep all the arguments about social liberalism and protection of rights for different ethnicities. So we get multiculturalism and same-sex relationships and women's equality. So in this sense, it looks as though both sets of liberalism, both classical and modern liberalism, have managed to be triumphant and have managed in some way to be kind of self-sustaining. Is that even if modern liberals don't like the idea of neoliberal economics, at least that neoliberal economics has created the conditions in which some aspect of modern liberalism, social liberalism, can survive. So it's like a kind of, like, it doesn't look as though one side's victory is at the expense of another here in terms of liberalism. And then, to sustain that, we get this really interesting development of technology. And of course, the fact that the internet and mobile telephones and social media come about and are part of the engines of spreading the ideas, the liberal ideas, but also in and of themselves, if you think about it, they are places in which the individual can be sovereign. So that they meet the classic, they meet the ideal of classical liberalism, where people get to construct their own identity. They don't have to be told what to do by any state about what they believe in or what they say. We get free speech as a result of mobile phones and into the internet and social media. And that idea that we become autonomous actors who are able to, in a way which is not quite unpoliced, but which is capable of demonstrating that we're able to receive ideas from each other, and there's a kind of marketplace of ideas of the type that John Stuart Mill would have talked about. So people can have wrong ideas on Twitter, but then other people will pile on and say, no, that's a wrong idea, and therefore, and from that we get more rational outcomes. That seemed to be the dream that coming true when we finally got mobile phones and social media. And if we wanted to add to that, then, that what that also leads to is an economic benefit. So the new technology isn't just about creating individual sovereign people who are free, it's also about providing an engine in which consumerism, which after all is one of the ways in which you construct your identity, becomes more possible. And so because the internet and means of producing things using the internet becomes cheaper, we get things more efficiently. So now it appears that even though there's inequality, it's still possible, because things can be produced so frictionlessly and cheaply and efficiently and all over the world, it's possible for even the poorest of people to be able to have a mobile phone. And, you know, most people, or at least millions of people, can have some Apple gadgets, and everybody can have, and here I'm speaking with a massively broad brush, and I know I'm oversimplifying it, but, you know, it appears that everybody can have a flat screen TV and can have can benefit from the growth of liberalism everywhere. So the trickle down appears to have happened. And we get this idea that there are permanent growth economies, and that liberalism has created this virtuous cycle in which economies will always continue to grow, and there'll be no more boom and bust, and no more crises. And since that's the case, since there's no longer a competing economic model, then when we vote, and this is the 8th point, for a party, we're no longer voting for a party which is either socialist or capitalist. Instead, what we get is all parties saying, because all people want more goods, and we want things to be cheaper, and we want low taxes, and we want to make sure that everybody's in a job, and we don't really care which party it is so long as they do it. And therefore you get former socialist parties all over the world, but not just New Labour, ditching their left-wing principles and adopting neoliberalism. But you also get conservative parties who have been nationalistic and patriotic and all the rest of it, ditching their patriotism and signing up to free trade and globalization and things like the EU as well. So we call this a post-ideological consensus, and the idea it's built on delivery, right? You know, here are all these things that you want. My party can deliver them better than the other party. So my party can deliver low taxes better than your party. My party can deliver a strong economy better than your party can. And no notion that there's going to be an alternative model there. And then finally, therefore, what that means is politics now is no longer about which party you have. If all parties are going to offer something similar, what we want now is to make sure that the people can have more say over how those parties deliver those things. So we want politics to be more responsive. We don't necessarily want to just put power in the hands of a party in order to deliver a type of economic model. We've got the model. What we want to do is make it meet our needs wherever we happen to be. So this is why the emphasis now shifts everywhere to constitutional reform and the way we do politics. So guaranteeing people's rights, fragmenting power, having different institutions to meet different needs at different levels. So we get devolution, but we also get the EU, supranational institutions, and so on. Okay, so far, so good. It looks as though liberalism has done its job in that respect. I'm going to pause for a minute before I talk about what happens next. Everything I've said here could be challenged, right? Everything I've said there could be a contention about it, but this is, this is the kind of narrative, is what we say these days, isn't it? This is the story which appears to show that liberalism has been more successful than any other ideology by the time we get to the 2000s. Does anybody want to ask anything about it before we crack on? All right then, good. Okay, you're still here? You just give me a quick thumbs up or a yes or no or something like that. I've gone off and made a cup of tea or something. Okay, good to see you. Excellent. Okay. So what happens next? Well, this happens next. Now, I'm not going to play this this time around. Normally I do this in the classroom. I'm always staggered at how many people have not seen the attack on the Twin Towers. They've not watched the YouTube video about it. But you ask anybody who was around at the time, it's kind of more or less my age, or you don't have to be that old, but where were you on 9/11? It's one of those moments, right? It's one of those things that happens and everybody remembers where they were. And everybody knew that it was a really big deal. But nobody really quite understood what impact it was going to have or what the implications were going to be. Think about that just right now for the moment, about the things that are going on right now in our world, and consider that, everybody knows COVID is massive, but nobody really knows why it's a turning point, but it definitely is a turning point, okay? And we might think about the implications of that in future sessions. But in this case, 9/11 was a turning point. And what I'm going to argue is it's the beginning of the end of liberalism, okay? Okay, so why is it the beginning of the end of liberalism? Well, I don't know if I can get past there. This is why liberalism began to lose the battle of ideas. And the first thing is to do with the fact that what it appeared to show was that there was evidence that the Enlightenment had not won. That there was still, not only was there still anti-Enlightenment and obviously religious ideas coming about in the 1990s, but they were becoming more prevalent and more and appealing to more people. And the reason they were appealing to more people is because of globalization. Globalization and American values were provoking them to, as they saw it, protect their own values and protect their own culture and protect their own identity. And that was made more so because where there was a vacuum created in the Middle East and other places that the USSR had left, American imperialism, American economic imperialism moved in, sometimes supported by American military influence as well. And that appeared to be kind of American empire building. So it didn't appear, to people in the Middle East and in the Arab East, this was no benign kind of victory of liberalism where everybody was part of the global village. It looked like the triumph of America. And therefore, there's a reason why 9/11 happens in New York, in the World Trade Center, at the heart of American imperialism, rather than somewhere else. So what happens next? And we get this kind of chain reaction then of other things, not least of which is the decline of tolerance. So up to this point, I've been talking about how the way in which there's almost this kind of escalator of everybody becoming more tolerant of everybody else's rights and identities and multiculturalism, and all that comes to a crashing halt on the 12th of September 2001. And really quickly, it's really difficult to overstate this actually. And I don't know if your entire lives, and they have been lived in a period in the shadow of 9/11, then it's really difficult to articulate how in the 1990s we were actually there was quite a sunny disposition and quite positive about what things were going to be like in terms of tolerance. After that, we see this massive spike in Islamophobia, a massive spike in anti-immigration movements, and a rise of nationalisms. And what that's based on is the idea that it's no longer the case where people think that liberalism is going to create this kind of mutual understanding among people. Instead, conservatives begin to talk about the idea there's going to be a clash of civilizations, that the 21st century is either a kill or be killed a scenario in which Western society, inverted commas, and what that's taken to mean is Christian liberal society, is in a fight to the death with something like a radical Islamic threat. And that justifies the stuff that comes next. And so, not only do we begin to see more anti-immigration policies and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we also begin to see something else which is really illiberal, the growth of an unlimited state power. So instead of thinking, all right, well, let's make sure we get more constitutional rights and more guarantees about what people can do, the war on terror appears to give a license to more state surveillance, more authoritarian controls of things like public speech, limits on free speech, public space rather, controls on control orders on people who are suspected of being terrorists, and that can be elastic about calling anybody you like terrorists in order to control them as well. Even to the point, of course, both in Britain and America and elsewhere in Europe as well, where people accept torture, imprisonment without trial, detention of all sorts of people without trial as well, and a kind of an acceptance that surveillance and that the state can have unlimited powers over people because that's about security. In other words, the Hobbesian idea of order above anything else, order being more important than individual rights, appears to have beaten the idea of liberalism and individual freedoms. And to add to that, what we get then is a growth of the sorts of politics that we hadn't seen before, faith-based politics and social attitudes, especially in America. So we see the growth of the US, in the US, conservative movements propelled by fundamentalist Christianity. So George W. Bush is a good example of somebody who was brought to power and kept in power by what we called at the time fundagelicals, on a platform really of what was described at the time as God, guns and gays. So it goes beyond any longer talking about defending yourselves against radical Muslims, and instead now becomes about protecting a white Christian identity and heritage. And that is illiberal. And what we see then is an extension of those illiberal values about racism and sexism and homophobia, which we had thought would just kind of go out of fashion. Those things come back with a vengeance. And they do so in a series of spikes. So it happens in the post 9/11, and then it happens, it rumbles on along the background with the background of Iraq and Afghanistan. And then other things come along to make it worse as well, like the crash of 2008, and particularly about things like Brexit as well. Okay, and then people begin to pick apart the negative consequences of globalization, because not everybody in globalization had been a winner. And in fact, there was a destructive effect of the free market on workers' rights and living conditions wherever this happened. So if you wanted to see why it was possible to buy a t-shirt for 99 pence in Primark, it was because there was a sweatshop conditions in Bangalore or in a Chinese labor camp. And you could see that there was a destruction. So that's abroad. So poorer countries have reason not to want to be engaged in globalization. And then in our country and in Western societies, what we get is the destruction of working class communities, which had previously been based around pretty solid manufacturing types of jobs, where they had previously been in a unionized, relatively well-paid job making something, and then that job had been taken away and then outsourced to somewhere like wherever, India or Taiwan or somewhere else. And so what we do is create this group of people for whom economic growth has not trickled down, and for who all they can see is a gap between the rich and poor growing, their wages and living conditions becoming worse, them becoming more indebted, and their lives becoming more precarious, and they don't feel like they've won out from this globalization business. And all that's brought to a head when we get the crash of 2008. And this is, liberalism. This is the failure of liberalism writ large, because you've got an unregulated financial market, that's laissez-faire capitalism, in America especially, with nothing to stop them loaning money to people who probably can never pay it back. And the reason why they can probably never pay it back is because their wages are so low and their contracts are so precarious that at some point they're going to lose their jobs. And so it's not their fault they can't pay it back, and it's not their fault they want to live in a house that a bank's prepared to lend them money. It's the bank's fault. But it's the market which has denied them the means of paying them their wages back. And when they can't pay their wages back, then the banks loaned everybody else's money to them and can't get it back, and that's why we get this crash. So now it looks as though capitalism isn't something which is like self-correcting and has an equilibrium like we talked about with classical economics. Now it needs to be rescued by governments printing money and giving our money to banks so that they don't collapse. And what that looks as though is that the cost of the financial collapse, of the problems of capitalism, is to be borne by the least well off. So not surprisingly, what we get is a rise of populism, a populist backlash against capitalism, against liberal capitalism. And this happens from both the right and the left. So from the right, obviously, this is where Trump has come from. This is where UKIP and Brexit and all of the other far-right movements that appear in Europe come from. What they're doing, they're appealing to a left-behind group. Left behind is a term we're going to use, and who have been made jobless and have been made to pay for the collapse of globalization and liberalism. And so as far as they're concerned, it's the free market and the free movement of people and a lack of national control, a lack of sovereignty in your own country, which has caused these problems. So now these new movements come along who say, well, we want to take back control. Okay, so that means economic nationalism. We don't want to be run by another country. We want to be sovereign. And also, we don't like free movement of people, so we're going to control immigration. And also, we don't like all this other stuff that came with globalization because it threatens our identity, so we're going to be culturally defensive. And that's easy to see in Trump, but of course it's replicated everywhere in France and the National Front, in Germany with the AfD, in Italy with Salvini, in Spain right now with Vox as well. But there isn't a European country you can point to which hasn't had a significant rise of some sort of far-right movement. Okay. There is, though, a response to that on the left as well. And so another reason why liberalism is threatened is because of the revival of socialism. So people had said after the fall of the Soviet Union, oh, that's it, socialism's dead, people never talk about this anymore. And then the crash happens, and then what we get is a wave of very left-wing movements, much more left-wing than the neoliberal New Labours and similar sorts of parties that had existed before. So in Greece, we get this movement, this party called Syriza, which is, in some ways is to the left of Corbyn, which gets elected, and it gets elected on a platform of saying, we're going to leave the EU because we don't want to pay back our debts to the German banks that they're forcing us to pay. Doesn't quite go as far as doing that when it gets elected, but we get similar movements in Spain and Portugal and France. And of course, in the US, we get the Occupy movement, and then we get Bernie Sanders. And in the UK, we get Corbyn and Momentum as well. And even though Corbyn's lost the leadership, there's no sign necessarily that kind of left-wing movement isn't, the energy of it isn't going to go somewhere else and into something which is not necessarily about liberalism. So finally then, where are we left with? A rise of protectionism. And if we can just be kind of, dark and foreboding for a moment, we've already seen this. Trump built his campaign on saying China is killing us. So we're going to ditch globalism. And instead what we're going to do is prevent China from selling its goods in our market. We're going to have tariffs on Chinese goods. And China, of course, responded by putting its own tariffs on American goods. And that intense competition for markets and intense attempts to prevent other countries from entering your own market has the potential to lead to not just economic conflict, but to other forms of conflict as well. And therefore, liberalism finds itself now in a bit of a dire state. And we might ask the question about, okay, what happens next? I'm going to pause for a moment because that's the second time when I whizzed through 9 quick points, and we'll see whether there's anything you want to ask about that. I'm going to take that silence for a moment as the fact that, okay, you've just been busy kind of like making notes on this as well, and you're happy enough that it looked pretty good, now it doesn't look so pretty good. Okay, I'm going to move on. What are the implications? Now, implications for us means AO3. Okay, this means that this is the last third of the marks, but it's the most difficult third of the marks. And so saying something interesting about why or what has happened when liberalism appears to be in a threat is a way of picking up making yourself different from the other students. What we're going to say, these 3 things, I suppose. The blue one, empirically, that means the evidence suggests that liberalism doesn't work. That, you could say in abstract, it might seem like a really good idea that, it'll create mutual understanding and reciprocity and free trade will have these effects. But if it doesn't actually describe reality, if the reality actually disproves liberalism's principles, then it's a duff ideology, right? It's failed as an ideology. That's certainly what people used to say about Marxism and socialism and things. When the Soviet Union collapsed, they say, well, look, it doesn't work. Now they're saying it about liberalism. Okay, so that's our first thing. The second thing is connected to this, and I think this is a way of kind of layering on. Okay, this is a bit more sophisticated, because what we're saying is, what I'm going to argue is that the temporary victory of neoliberalism, when neoliberalism came along with Thatcher and the New Right in the 1970s and said, right, okay, let's create small states and let's roll back all this kind of expansion of the enabling state, which has grown up after the Second World War. What it does is it also rolls back equality and means by which there was a kind of social glue that kind of kept people together, both countries internationally, but also internally within societies, that made it possible for people to have a mutual understanding of each other. And that kind of gaping inequality effectively meant that neoliberalism destroyed the good points of modern liberalism, so that neoliberalism destroyed itself. That it's contradictory in and of itself. And I think this is useful when you're talking at the end of any kind of essay about liberalism. You've got a modern strand and a classical strand. Does it matter that they've got some tensions between them? They do if they actually negate each other. If one undermines the other to make it impossible for either of them to exist, then it's self-destroying, right? And therefore, as an ideology, it's utterly flawed, fundamentally flawed. Okay. The last thing is, and this is, I suppose, often people ask about when you make comparisons with other ideologies, and you'll never get an essay that says compare liberalism and conservatism. It doesn't mean occasionally for evaluation purposes, you can't just say, well, this is why conservatives would make this point about it. And one of the things that it appears is that liberalism made assumptions about human nature. We'd become more rational. We would become more cooperative. That the more we understood each other's needs, the more likely it was that we become more peaceful and so on. And those things appear not to have been true. That we now have recurrent crises. We're more fearful of each other. We're more prone to take authoritarian solutions. It's democracies all over the world which are voting for authoritarian strongmen. They're almost exclusively men. And therefore, what liberalism is doing is generating the circumstances in which this authoritarianism exists rather than eradicating them. And from a comparative point of view, what that looks as though is that the Hobbesian view that we would rather have order, even if it means losing some individual freedoms, appears to be more successful than the liberal view that we value individual freedom over everything else at the moment. Good. Okay. So there you go. That was like a little lecture. That wasn't it? It's like 25 minutes or so of me just talking about some points. some people prefer this kind of thing when I just kind of like, rattle out a few points. But do you want to ask anything about anything I've said so far today? Has it made sense? Let me ask you that, I suppose. Yeah, great. Okay, thanks. Good stuff. Always nice to have a little bit of validation that okay, we're not actually just shouting into the abyss, and so on. I've left a couple of things on here. Conclusion: is liberalism dead? And those are the kind of things that you could add as further ways of unpacking this as a point if you were writing about it. But mainly, it's just so we can finish this off. Okay, last 5 or 10 minutes, however long you need, depends what you want to ask, or if you want to ask anything at all. Does anybody want to ask anything about the question, the 24-mark question? I mean, strictly speaking, it's due tomorrow, but I probably won't mark them all over the weekend. So if it comes in on Monday, it's not a disaster, but I'll try and get everybody's back to them by Friday. I think I said on the classroom post, if you get it to me by tomorrow, I'll guarantee getting it back to you before next Friday. If it comes afterwards, you might have to wait a little longer for it. But does anybody want to ask anything about that question? So it could be about the structure. It could be about whether you're having any difficulty in using the template that I gave you, which is basically kind of tells you which ones are the agree paragraphs and which ones are the disagree paragraphs. And it's fine if you haven't. That's okay. And also, you can ask if you want if there's anything else that we've done so far in liberalism that you're just not sure about. Does it matter if I'm over the word count for the essay? Not really, Lily. So the reason I put the word count on, it's not super strict, right? But the problem for our essays is that it's a 24-mark question, and you've got 30 minutes to write it. And I think with all the best will in the world, few people are going to write much more than 700 or 800 words in 30 minutes. Maybe if you're really fast writer, you can do about 1,000. And what that means is that therefore there's no point in kind of like writing, a 10-page essay about everything you know about liberalism, because part of the process that we're doing here is practicing the structure, and then within that, the paragraph structure. So every sentence counts. However, if you've gone over a bit, then of course, that's because you know more than you can fit in, which is great. It's better to know more, better to have more to say than you can squeeze in, rather than nothing to say and then, waffling or just leaving big gaps and things as well. So short answer, no, but that's why there is a word count. And it's why I suppose this is, again, it's not really about whether you've really understood liberalism, although that's one of the things I'm looking for. It's about, can we begin to practice using this 24-mark structure? You do this with me. Obviously, you're going to do one for Dom as well. And then when we come back in August, we'll do some more of these types of questions on feminism and socialism in the first 5 weeks when we get back. Is that okay? Great. Okay. You're welcome. The other thing I was going to say before we go is I'll have another session next week. It'll be but I won't teach you anything. Okay, I won't kind of like say, well, here's a bit of content stuff. It'll just be a drop-in thing, and it can be for anything that we've done this year. Really, it's just an opportunity to say goodbye and have a nice summer. But if you've been thinking about how do I catch up or any of those kind of things, then that's what the session will be. The other thing that I'll do next week, and I'll put something on Classroom at the beginning of the week, is to say something about our summer work. So I'm not going to give you masses to do, and it's actually quite a nice open-ended thing. And what it produces is a really good, when we get back in the classroom, it produces a really good opportunity to talk about some things in detail about American politics. I did it this year as a kind of big question thing. I'll explain a bit more next week, but you basically get to choose what aspects of American politics you're going to look into, and then you do your own bit of investigation to tell us about after the holidays. So you can find out a little bit more about that and ask any questions about that next week as well. Okay. So unless there's anything else that you want to ask, I'm going to say that's probably us for today. Okay, and you should get out and enjoy the sunshine if you can do. Is that all right with everybody else? Great. Okay, smashing. Okay, nice to see you virtually, if nothing else as well. And hopefully I'll get to see you again next week. Oh, keep an eye on Classroom. I'm going to post one more thing for us, a question, which will be about Trump and the F word. Okay, so yeah. Thank you. Okay, bye. Take care. Hey, Janet.
Hello.
There you go. Okay, I'm going to stop
Sorry, I
recording.
got laughed in the middle of that.